Welcome to Money Talks. I'm Liam Dann, New Zealand Herald Business Editor at Large. This is a podcast where we talk to New Zealanders about money and how it has shaped their lives. We're not going to tell you how to get rich, we're not even going to pick the next interest rate move, but we are going to get you thinking about your relationship with money and what it really means to you. Thanks to sponsors Milford Asset Management. With me today I have Brad Olsen, who is Principal Economist and Director at Infometrics, and fast becoming a familiar voice and face as one of the country's most high-profile economic commentators. Hi Brad, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Hey, look, I'm going to be a little bit rude at the start and ask about your age, if that's okay. You're still 24 or 25?
I'm still 24, grand old age of 24, yet to sort of hit the place where I feel like I can have a quarter-life crisis. And I mean, it's something that has been, well, one commented on a bit, probably more questioned by a lot of people. I often ask people how old they think I am, getting at the moment an average of about 31, which I think is a good number, but, a very different focus, I guess, or place to be as an economist and talking about the economy. I haven't had 25 years in and out of banks and government institutions and similar. I've barely had 25 years on this here earth.
Yeah, well, I mean, you often talking to people about their memories of the GFC or even right back into the 70s and 80s. So this is a bit different. You probably, you don't have to be the spokesperson for the entire generation. But would you consider yourself? Are you Gen Z or millennial at that age?
I'm technically a Zoomer. I'm 19 days into the cutoff, or after the cutoff for a millennial, and I wear my Zoomer badge with pride in a sense. And I guess, it is an interesting position, I guess, an age that I occupy. I still remember, driving in the ute with Dad, with the cassette player going and playing VCRs on the TV, but also very rapidly going into the likes of the iPhone, iPod age, DVD players coming through, then being replaced with streaming services. So, in a sense, try and straddle the divide between all of those elements with what seems to be, and certainly talking to people who are older than me, seems to be a very rapid pace of change sort of throughout the early 2000s and into the 2010s.
Yeah, and I guess the whole thing about your generation is you've just grown up with it. That's the norm. Economics tends to skew a little older. I mean, and people come into it and get obviously more focused on it as they get older when they start to think about their own wealth and things. How do people respond to your youth, I guess, when you sort of do you ever find it difficult to be taken seriously and that sort of thing?
Well, in a sense, if I feel like if I come into a conversation starting out with, look, hi, everyone, I'm 24, people do switch off, or they do, the questioning looks start very, very quickly. What is interesting is when the reverse happens. Often I'll give a presentation or speak to a whole bunch of people without my age coming up. We'll have a really detailed conversation, and then my age will come up at the end. And no one sort of says, "Oh gosh, if you told me you were 24 at the start, I wouldn't listen to you at all." But you do sort of get the feeling that people are quite taken aback by it. Now, that's no skin off my nose. I'm made of thicker stuff than age challenges. But it is interesting, I think, that feeling that you do have to be older to sort of have that knowledge and a voice, particularly because I'm focused quite a lot at the moment, as everyone is, on COVID-19, and there's no rule book for that.
No,
the best we can get right is back in the 1920s or so, and no one really is still around from that point. So I feel like it's a unique position to occupy, not only sort of growing my economic credentials during COVID-19, but not having any baggage from previous experiences to sort of shape my judgment. It's pretty raw and being shaped in real time by the information that we see coming through.
So how old were you when you started getting interested in the idea of money and how it works?
Probably quite early on. The youngest memory I have of something really directly related to that was during intermediate. I can't remember. I think it was sort of year 7, year 8, first or second form. I think for those under that system. And I remember starting the year one year with one of those small little sort of hand-sized notebooks, and I, from the TV news, wrote down the stock market numbers each day for about 2 weeks or so until I lost the streak, I think.
Yeah.
And I sort of went, oh well, that's that. But I was interested in what's making movements, or what were the movements, and then trying to understand what's making the movements. Now, everyone knows that trying to sort of pick the day-to-day challenges or rationale behind the stock markets is sort of on a big losing streak anyway. But it was interesting to try and look at that. And as I went on, my focus was always trying to understand the world around me, and economics gave me what I found to be a pretty good basis for that, trying to understand the why. Something's happened. Why did it happen? Why did people respond in that way? What were their motivations? That was something that continued to shape me and continues to shape me to this day.
So looking right back, so you grew up in Whangarei?
Yes, spent all 18 years of first 18 years of life there. Grew up in Tikapanga with the family, mum, dad, and my sister, and moved up through. Went to St Francis Xavier primary school, then on to Carmel Intermediate, and then on to Whangarei Boys High. I feel like the way that other people went, and probably myself, have characterised me. I was a bit of a nerd. I was pretty focused on the books and what have you. As I got sort of through it, though, I did start to develop a much greater focus, I guess, on the community. So at primary school, I was writing to an MP about water quality and similar. Throughout my time at Carmel, I went over to an international problem-solving competition and did a lot of other extracurriculars there. And then at Whangarei Boys High, was a member of the Whangarei District Council's Youth Advisory Group, and also tried to help set up a free youth health clinic, Octane Health. So there was always, I guess, again, comes back to that practical application. It was always trying to understand what was motivating change, and therefore also how could I create change and better outcomes in my community with the skills that I had. Look, I come from Whangarei. I feel like, there are some pretty entrenched social issues, and that, I think, spurred me to go, well, actually, okay, how do we change things? And what was very apparent very early on in life is that the dollar talks, and I mean that in terms of it makes people sit up and listen, and it also is a much more often persuasive argument because, numbers are a lot more hard and fast. Taking on the heartstrings is important, but at the nitty-gritty, having the dollar figures behind you is often quite critical to helping shape those decisions. And I realised that, at least my frame of view, that if I wanted to try and make a difference, understanding those motivations and how to put that case was going to be important for me. And that's really been a driver. So it was never about the money per se. And I think that sort of shapes my own philosophy with money. I remember quite clearly, my parents got me a Nintendo DS for Christmas one year. When I was probably 9 or so, and we went out on the boat one day. Foolish me! You should never take out time on the boat. You should spend the time fishing. I dropped that in the water, and I remember Dad sort of looking at me and saying, "Well, you've got some savings. You might need to consider if you want to buy that, or if you want to buy something different, or if you want to keep your money." And that was, I think, a really good instruction to me. That look, it's my money. I've got some choices. It's scarce. There's not a huge amount of it out there. What do I want to get out of my money has always been a question I ask myself, and often it's not, I just want to create more so that I can have flashy things. That's never in my mind been a real driving focus.
Yeah, it is one of the questions I like to ask people is about whether they got pocket money as a kid. What even the first memories you have of holding cash in your hand, and what I guess did you save up for the new Nintendo?
I did save up for the new Nintendo. I did get pocket money, and went out and had to take out the rubbish at points and do the dishes and what have you. Of course, begrudgingly. Classic kid didn't want to do it, but understood the value of, well, if I do the work, then I get some money. Doing a little bit of work as well for my grandparents and similar. I remember, my grandparents used to give out a little bit every now and then, but also, in return, I'd be around there most days chopping wood for the fire. They had a fire going all year round, bless them. Even on Christmas Day, it was incredible. But that was always something where the return was something that you focused on. It was an exchange. I do this work, and there's some money that comes out of it. I'm not gonna lie. I'm also try to be a bit of a bargain hunter. The sort of thing. Did I need a brand new PS2 or PS3? No. If I can get the old PlayStation 1 with the original Need for Speed, for what did we get it for? I think it was like $80 at a garage sale or something. That was a pretty good deal back then. And gosh, it's probably worth a lot at the moment. I didn't have a classic part-time job. I didn't go and work retail or hospitality or anything, working at Hallenstein's or in a local cafe when I was younger. I spent a lot of time volunteering with the Youth Advisory Group, with a number of other organisations, and I always sort of look back on that and wonder, that's quite a different way, right? But most young people of some way, shape or form go and get a part-time job, and so the fact that my first job ever, in a sense, was working for Infometrics as a data analyst and then rising up the ranks, I think is something I reflect on sometimes and think, well, if I could go back, maybe I would have wanted to try and get a part-time job, both from the money point of view, but also the experience it gives you with people in the real world.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, when did you? How old were you when you joined Infometrics?
I would have been 18 at that time, joining again very much in the lowest rung and wanting to work my way up. I spent days, putting numbers into spreadsheets from PDF documents and company reports or council reports, updating the various underlying sets of data for the forecasting team and what have you, and eventually sort of moved up the ranks.
Yeah, so you worked your way through and up through Infometrics concurrently at the same time as you were doing your degree. Is that?
Indeed. I'm not going to lie. Trying to do a double degree and work at the same time put some pressures on time, and didn't leave a huge amount of time for social life. But that was always a key focus from my point of view, as I was intensely interested in the work that we did and wanted to give it my all. Of course, still wanted to get my degree.
One of the things I like to ask is what's the poorest you've ever been? Was there a sort of a point where you were the kind of classic cash-strapped student and you were living on baked beans and all that sort of stuff, or having that security of the job on the way through must have helped?
Oh, it was a huge asset, and I think helped because I know how awful this sounds, but really not a big fan of baked beans or spaghetti on toast and anything. So sort of needed to have some sort of security. Look, I think part of it as well. I worked hard to get some scholarships and that coming into university and similar. So that certainly helped pay my way. But also, I didn't have a lot of things that I wanted to spend on when I was at university. Personally, I don't drink, so there was no need to go and spend a huge amount on that during university times, and I tried to keep all the other bills as limited as possible, just because I wasn't frugal, but also don't feel like I was sort of particularly flashy or trying to pull in all the money. So it was something that I don't think I was. I honestly don't know what the answer to what's the poorest I've been, but I don't feel like I was ever in a position where I felt compromised by my financial situation, and I realised how privileged that was, but also worked very hard to ensure that I always had a buffer. And I guess in my frame of mind, that's always been probably the first thing I focus on from a financial point of view is, do I have a buffer in place for if things go wrong? Because I don't have a lot that I'm sort of focused on actively or proactively trying to spend or invest in. I'm sort of quite comfortable where I am and therefore looking for that buffer.
Yeah, so it's sort of like you're looking at it from the perspective of those sort of mainstream, sensible personal finance rules and following the basics without being kind of like hugely adventurous and you're not playing cryptocurrencies and all that kind of thing.
No, not personally. And look, I mean, part of that comes down to risk tolerance. I'm probably a pretty defensive person in general when it comes to finances and wanting to have that buffer. I mean, the mere fact that that's the first thing I focus on, I think underscores that. I think it's also, I personally sort of quite like the set and forget model. So, KiwiSaver is a great one there where it goes in and I don't touch it. I never see it. I have no idea, what it looks like week to week. And I sort of feel like that's important because I almost wouldn't want the temptation of having to play with it a lot.
Do you think for your generation, just to even have a view or for more young people having a view on personal finance? Because years ago, as I came through, I don't think people did. They were probably thinking about a house. And I just wonder how much the difficulty of getting to the housing market you think might have changed younger people's attitudes. They are sort of being forced to look at other investment opportunities because for whatever reason, well, obviously the price, but also just the, whether you're in a relationship and all those things, getting, the house isn't the be all and end all, or it just can't be for a lot of young people now.
No, and there's two elements there. One is the just incredible pace that house prices have outstripped wages and incomes and even rents over time, to the degree now that, you for a first home buyer wanting to buy an average house across the country, you're talking over $250,000 just in a deposit. I mean, that's a pretty eye-watering amount of cash. It's also, I guess, if you will, the democratization of the stock market and similar. You can now play with Sharesies or Hatch or any of those other investment opportunities much easier than previously. Stock market used to be a big end of town thing, and now it's not. But I sort of feel like there's a bit of chicken and the egg there as well. I feel like a number of young people still very much want to be able to buy a house, but the fact of the matter is that just relying on KiwiSaver or savings or working hard, I don't know if working hard gets you a house these days. I'd certainly like to think that I live in a country where working hard means you can get a house, but financially, when we've seen that basically for every step forward that you take with your income, house prices have moved 12 steps ahead, and really you're not getting any further ahead because your rent is probably increasing at the same pace as your income. You have to take some more risks. You've got to get lucky, and you've got to basically use your money in a different way. So I think a lot of people are using the stock market, Sharesies and similar to get a housing deposit, but it is taking longer. And all of this is, I think, shaping how young people, particularly millennials, but increasingly Zoomers now, as we come into that age, around what our lives look like. We know that young people in New Zealand and overseas are getting into relationships later in life, they're getting married, they're having kids later in life. I think a lot of that is because you don't have that same social security of housing that previous generations did. You've got people that have higher, what people call social mobility, the ability to move around parts of the country and the world for different types of work. But I wonder if that's actually because of necessity rather than anything else, because as we've seen during the global financial crisis, and again with COVID-19, younger groups of people are very much first out when the challenges come through. And that's a big difficulty without that sort of security that you might have from your job or your house. If you don't have those things, then you do have to be a lot more flexible about where you work, what you do, and how you're using your money.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you feel about debt, sort of personally, and also just any thoughts on your generation thinking about debt? There's certainly a generation older than me has sort of been really heavily influenced by the late 70s and 80s and is very nervous about debt. I just wonder how you see it.
I feel like young people, my age, are nervous about debt, but we're also realistic that debt's the only real pathway in life for us. A lot of young people are having to get a student loan just to get sort of an average job these days. We've had qualifications creep over a long period of time, and certainly from a housing perspective, you look at things and you go, well, I'm going to be probably looking at approaching 7 figures worth of debt when you combine the student loan and housing mortgage debt and similar. So it's a huge burden, I think, but from a lot of young people's point of view, it is a fact of life. It's just a reality that people have got to cope with. It's always surprised me a little bit. I mean, I've talked to, my grandparents, one of which, got paid to go to teachers college. And gosh, I would have loved that opportunity. Someone paid for me to become an economist. Now, yes, I got a scholarship, but, you look at how much people pay in housing now at university, it's far more than they pay for the actual tuition. And so I think, you're seeing a lot more people that are sticking around, staying with mum and dad for a lot longer. Certainly more people looking at different employment opportunities, going into the trades so they can earn while they learn on the job. Those opportunities are becoming much bigger. But I feel from that debt position, we are having to get a bit more realistic about what that looks like. The challenge I find for young people is because we haven't had that same focus on debt in previous times, it is something that young people are going to have to grapple with more. Now, I speak of that both from sort of a personal, private point of view, given how much money and debt outstanding people have on housing and consumer loans and what have you, but also from sort of a government and both local and central government point of view. We haven't invested as a country well enough in the future. We haven't sort of taken that future forward-looking element of having intergenerational equity, which means that we're going to have to spend a lot more and borrow a lot more sooner rather than later to fund that sort of deficit of infrastructure and everything else. And that's eventually going to lump it on young people. And it does sort of frustrate me that for years we've seen, councils around the country with people getting elected on low rates basis, even though there's a huge amount of pet projects they want to get on. That is lumping future generations with debt. It's the same as what the government is doing now. Is that debt smart? Absolutely. We want to have the economy that's actually, moving forward and that we're getting people into jobs. But we can't kid ourselves that we're not leaving a ticking time bomb for future generations. That means that the young people of tomorrow are not going to have the same opportunities. And I think there is going to be some real challenging conversations that might well divide different generations. We know, for example, that some young people, realistically, the only way they're going to get housing is waiting for grandparents and parents to die and inherit houses. I mean, it's not a nice conversation, but from a lot of young people's point of view, it's realistic. For a lot of other young people, their parents didn't even have houses to start with, so they're going to inherit nada. That sort of driving divide in wealth between the haves and the have-nots, I think, will be exacerbated, particularly for Zoomers and those who come after us. And it is a real challenging position, because debt is not a conversation, I think, that we have, that we talk about in New Zealand with a lot of clarity. There's a huge amount of emotion mixed in, but never the same recognition of who actually has to pay it off in future times. I mean, the fact that we've got, hospitals around the country with poo running down the walls, the fact that we've got streets with poo running outside the, doors, is a crying indictment on the state of New Zealand. Yet we continue to worry about the money that we spend. I would say that we need to spend a lot more. And yes, my future generation will have to pay for it. But gosh, I'd rather we pay for it and get something good sooner rather than later than wait for costs to go up and still has some pretty poor outcomes.
Still have to pay for it. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to come back to that. We touched on at the start, the idea that, when I look at the economic narrative in New Zealand, it's so heavily influenced, and I was a kid, but I sort of still am part of it. That time in the late 70s, and you would have studied it, and then the end of the Muldoon era, we almost went broke. New Labour government comes in, and we do all our neoliberal stuff. It kind of it seems like some sort of formative, almost like a founding type mythology to what's sort of shaped the economic narrative ever since. And I just wonder, you mentioned you sort of come with no baggage in a sense, because you don't have the same, you won't have the same attitude to inflation and some of those things that maybe some of these older economists will have because of that, right?
I guess I say that in terms of, I've never thought it was a worthwhile exercise to relitigate the way that New Zealand approached things in the 70s and 80s. A great conversation piece, sure, but at the end of the day, we currently have a system that we're operating in, and we can either reshape that system and how it operates and improve it, or we can sort of navel gaze about what we did 40 years ago. The fact of the matter is 40 years ago is past. It's well past, and yes, it helps shape the foundations that we're operating in, but if we want to make a difference, we make that with today's settings and the tweaks that we've sort of continued to make since the 70s.
So it is kind of feels like a time where we're into a little bit of a clean slate. But I guess the debate is with some of those older economists about how much do we think is absolutely fundamental to economics, and how much do we think is driven by what's happening in the world around us right now.
Absolutely. And I mean, from my point of view, we've got to take a pretty wide lens to that in terms of, we haven't had a good supply shock, if you will, for a number of years. Really, the last big supply shock that New Zealand or the rest of the world really faced was probably the oil shocks of the 70s. And again, the current supply chain and supply shocks that we see are different from just pure oil or energy needs. It's production, it's people moving about, how that changes consumer preferences, where money goes and similar. So it really is a bit of a clean slate. I think as well, though, there's COVID has shown that there are some immediate short-term things that we have to focus on, but in a sense, I think has masked some of the longer-term challenges that we're faced with. In New Zealand, we're still grappling with what we do with social welfare and particularly superannuation in future years, and as well as the healthcare system. But we've also more globally looking at climate change and the implications that has. One reason that I think that you could well have inflation that starts to hold at a slightly higher level than previously people would think about it is that you've got China, which previously, was the manufacturing site for the world. The production warhorse for the globe, it was churning out everything at generally a pretty low cost. Now you're starting to see the Chinese government and other manufacturers around the world going, well, actually, we need to limit back some production or find a greener way to do these things because of our international commitments, and that there is going to, if not drive up the price of some production, at least stop it driving even further lower. So I think there are some sort of large component changes we're going to see in my lifetime around that. There's also that rising focus on an economy that's more inclusive for everyone, moving away from the pure GDP metrics, which, I mean, I've always found interesting as a younger person coming up, that I never took GDP to be, the be-all and end-all metric of how things were going. I'd like to think I used in a relatively plain English environment of this is, final demand for goods and services in the economy. It's never been designed to tell you if everyone is doing well. It's designed to tell you how much activity there is. If you're worried about distribution, and I think distribution, who the haves and the have-nots, is a much greater focus now than it was 10, 15 years ago, that will be a growing conversation that we need to understand, both as a country but also globally.
Do you find yourself drawn into the politics, and how do you feel about that traditional sort of left-right debate?
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like increasingly there are parts of those conversations, only because the more that you have a voice, the more that people some people want to hear it, and others want to sort of critique and ridicule. That's fine. Again, I'm made of thicker stuff than that. What is, I think, a big challenge is also, again, turning that conversation from isolating problems and challenges and wrongdoings, if you will, into solutions and actions. I mean, we can navel gaze till the cows come home about why things are good, bad, or ugly. It's until we sort of figure out what we want to do with it that the rubber really hits the road. And so I think, look, you do have a real challenge at the moment, focusing on one or two narrow metrics, and also the interpretation that some people cast on them. I mean, look, the fact of the matter is, going back to debt before, debt's a bad thing you hear from a lot of people, but if that was true, then no one would buy a house, no one would be able to buy them outright. So things have their place, and I think we just need to have probably a broader conversation around what we measure. The likes of GDP, sure, it measures some things. It doesn't tell us about who's in work, so we look at labour market indicators. Do we just look at the unemployment rate? Absolutely not. There's a huge number of other numbers, and I guess that's why, from my point of view, I find what I try to focus on is one, understanding that quite complex story of what the economy is doing and is likely to do going forward, but also an element of what I sort of call triangulation. There's never a pure data point, if you will, that tells the story of New Zealand's economy or a regional economy or how the globe is going. There's a whole lot of data points that you have to combine together to get a general vibe for where things are and where things are heading next. And from my point of view, that's important to have as much information about as many different elements as possible, rather than fixating on one or 2 points.
I mean, I just wonder, is that communication aspect, which I think is one of your strengths, is that something that just comes naturally, or have you done work on the media side of it?
Not necessarily. I mean, look, I've always loved to talk. Anyone that knows me will find it very hard to think of a time where I would shut up. And look, but mum tells me that from my youngest days, I was pretty quick to try and speak. I certainly haven't done any formal training. In fact, I used to have an awful stutter, Liam, when I was younger. Right. Which is quite a turnaround in a sense. But I think what I have focused on is again trying to get useful information out to people that they can try and make some decisions on. And so, from a political point of view, I think, look, I recognise that we live in a political environment, and anyone that sort of forgets that, I think, is doomed to fail when it comes to making change. The best thought out academic response to something has absolutely no impact if you can't get it through into the public domain and get some buy-in. So we live in an inherently political world, and I try to remember that every day.
Sure. If you were in power, this is sort of a hypothetical question, I guess, but how would you want to try and address inequality? Is there one economic policy or policy area where you would focus, I guess, to try and change things and make a difference?
Look, I think education's always been a big one, because it does allow people to sort of shape their own outcomes a lot more. Now, part of that is allowing people to actually access education. There's sort of wider ramifications there. But, I'd love to see something like a national skills plan or similar in New Zealand, so that we can actually identify where our gaps are and start to much more directly address some of those gaps, being able to provide some foresight when young people are moving through the education system at what some of the pathways are going forward.
Any thoughts on how you'd really up our productivity?
Look, I think one of the big challenges sometimes for New Zealand is getting out of a no mindset. Now, that might be a little bit uncharitable, but I do get incredibly frustrated that every time there is a conversation that goes on, we seem to want to find the absolute perfect policy that will solve all our issues, which means that sometimes we relitigate the same issue for years and years on end, instead of just getting on with something that, look, might not fully meet the requirements, but gets us a good 75-80% of the way there. And because of it, we waste a lot of time and energy. We don't get people on board, and we don't provide any certainty for businesses for different processes across the country. A good example of that in Wellington at the moment is Let's Get Wellington Moving. You look at a lot of what was prescribed in that, it was set out in the 90s in the Wellington Transport Spine Study. We've been talking about this for longer than I've been alive. And still, I'm likely to be into middle age, well into middle age by the time we get boots on the ground and diggers in the earth. It says to me that we need to be able to be a lot more nimble as a country, but we also need to figure out ways to say, yes, we can find ways to mitigate some of the challenges and the unintended outcomes that come with some of these policy changes. But I feel like saying a straight blank no to so much and trying to sort of water down policies and actions so that everyone is happy and therefore no one is happy is actually a pretty poor outcome. We need to be, I think, a lot stronger with moving forward and making real change. When we come to a decision, we stick with it, we see it through, rather than trying to muddle on with no real change that's tinkering around the sides. It costs a huge amount. We do it, rinse and repeat every 3 to 4 years. New Zealand saying no so often and not finding a way to say a comprehensive yes is a real challenge in my mind.
That's great, Brad. Look, I'm going to have to leave it there, but I just want to say thanks for that, and I look forward to chatting to you some more in the new year as we sort of work through all these things and hopefully come out of this weird COVID sort of oppression we're living with.
Absolutely, and look, thanks so much for having me, and really enjoyed the conversation.
Good stuff. Cheers. And thank you for listening. If you've got feedback, drop me a line at liam.dan@nzme.co.nz. Follow Money Talks on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes this season are out every Saturday, and you can find more business news in the New Zealand Herald or at nzherald.co.nz.